So yeah, my name's Ajay Patel, and today, like you've heard, we're going to talk about getting your tech out of the lab and onto the market. And we're going to focus on doing this in a way that's efficient from a cost and a time perspective. So before we dig in a couple things, like Sam mentioned, if you have any questions at all during this presentation, please type them into the chat box. My colleagues, Kate and Sarah, are both going to be checking these out, and we'll discuss them as they kind of come up throughout the presentation. So, before we dive in, just a quick background on myself. I'm the engineering manager and the site lead for the San Diego branch of Goddard Inc. So Goddard Inc. is a 23-year-old product development firm. They focus mainly on medical devices, life science tech, industrial robotics, and they're based both in Boston and San Diego. So me, myself, my entire career has been kind of in these areas as well, with mainly a focus on the IVD market, as far as kind of point of care devices, throughput instruments, and as well as industrial robotics and consumer devices mixed in. So a lot of my time I spent focused as well on the early part of that process. So my mechanical engineering background mixed in with some systems engineering and program management, it kind of allowed me to work with clients from that outset and help start that partnership and lead them through to production. So one area that has always directly impacted how successful my clients are in kind of getting into that production is actually at the very beginning with how well they take that leap going from on the lab bench out into the development process. And that's what we're going to spend our time focusing on today. So I'm hoping you leave this webinar with an appreciation for how important this step is and what things to consider when deciding to make that leap. So the leap itself, why is this topic important at all? So generally speaking, companies usually have the constraint of money and or time to market. Now, if you make that leap too early before you're ready, the chance for rework increases. You might be leading your development team to make decisions and go down a development path that's actually not correct. And generally speaking, when that happens, having to bring the team back in and switch directions can cost a lot of money depending on where you are in that process. Now, on the other hand, let's say you take your time, build that foundation extremely well, do everything methodically. Well, that's great too, but you also have competitors you might be worrying about. And if you get to market 4 months later than them, well, what does that mean for your market adoption? So really, there's that fine balance of trying to get it right. And we're going to discuss some different ways to kind of go through that based on our own experience. So this is the outline of the different topics we're going to discuss. This by no means is every little detail that can go into helping make that decision, but this is a pretty important set of 5. So the first thing we're going to talk about is actual timelines, when to make that leap. Secondly, we'll focus on the user aspects, understanding your user and making sure you have that knowledge ahead of making that leap. Third, we'll talk about requirements, which for me, I'm going to break down into both product requirements and design input requirements, which I'll detail later. That will spill into the workflow side, which is breaking down your secret sauce or your process and understanding the development impacts it has. And finally, we'll finish off with planning for the future products, but doing so now or on the earlier side. So let's get into it. When to make that leap. Now, many companies know when they need to get to market. And I bet for all of you and all of your companies, I'm guessing that's Q2 2021 at this point, which is crazy, but that's usually how it goes. But how do you figure out when to make that jump such that you meet that timeline goal? So the best thing to do is work backwards. Now, the first thing that I'm going to talk about is something you all should be pretty familiar with, which is how much remaining time do you have to develop your core technology? I'm hoping you guys have an understanding of the different hurdles that are ahead of you and rough estimates, so keep that in mind to start. But there's other important aspects that are non-core tech related that you should be considering. So one example is regulatory timelines. How long does it take to get that submission in? What's the amount of time to get the back and forths done? Additionally, any of those documentations from a quality management system, is that something that you're able to squeeze in parallel, or is there back-end effort? Another one is clinical trials. Setting those up, getting the right amount of people, being able to conduct the right amount of tests, that all takes time. And another one that sometimes doesn't get thought of too much is tooling lead times. So let's say the product that you're coming up with is something that's going to be developed in the thousands of quantities or the multiple thousands of quantities. Well, from an engineering standpoint, that puts it as a candidate, for example, for injection molding. Now, if you have a basic injection molding tool, oh, okay, 6 to 8 weeks of time. But depending on your need, let's say you're developing a specific consumable that requires a specialized process, that could take anywhere from 12 to 16 weeks. And again, that might only be for the first iteration run. If you need to do a second iteration past that, that might add some more time. So some of these aspects come into play and already hampered down on your timeline. So you want to add those in as well with how much time you need for your core tech. And a third thing to think about here is also, when do you think your competitors might get to the market? Now, I understand that this is nebulous. You may or may not know, but there's some value in thinking about this and adding that number in. So these ones, along with other factors, you can kind of work backwards and time that back with, okay, when do I need to jump? Now, usually there's two options, right? One option, oh man, I actually needed to make that leap 6 months ago. So what do you do at that point? Well, take a step back, look at where you are, and figure out, okay, my core technology is 80% of the way developed, and I still need time. Well, the question I would pose to you is, do you actually need that time? Is this something that last 20% you can actually work in parallel while the development team starts going in one direction? Or maybe is that 80% good enough to get enough market adoption and prevent yourself from slipping too far behind your other competitors? Take an honest look at why you absolutely need to go to that 100% of what you're trying to do. And you very well could need to, but just in case you don't, that's something to consider. And the same thing applies if, like, let's say you are ahead of the game still, but the leap that you need to make is earlier than you're expecting. Again, take that step back, understand how much time you have, how much time you want to spend, and see if there's a good move that you can make. There's no real one answer to this. And again, I completely sympathize with your desire to get things absolutely right, especially when it comes to your process. But my one piece of advice that I'm going to say here, which is going to echo throughout the rest of this presentation, to me, it's about understanding what you're up against, having the context behind, if I make this decision, what is the downstream impact? And at least that allows you to make a little bit more of an informed decision on what you're trying to do. So planning will always help you out. So next, we're going to talk all about the user. Now, this first part is obvious again, right? If the users don't actually want what your core tech is supposed to do, then market adoption will get impacted. It's that simple, but it's still extremely critical. So one example I have is I worked with a diagnostic client of mine, and they made the jump and they were rushing forward into trying to get to market. And one of the requirements that we had to work to is turnaround time. For those of you who don't know, in the diagnostic business, turnaround time is essentially the time from when your patient provides the sample to when they get the results back. Now, for this specific diagnostic machine, it's point of care. So the idea here is that patients submit their sample and don't leave the hospital and get the answers back at a reasonably quick amount of time. So how much time is actually quick enough, right? 5 minutes? No problem. People are willing to wait. 3 hours? Probably not. They're not going to want to tolerate waiting that long for results. They'd rather go back home. Well, in this case, the client that we had was trying to get to market as quick as possible, but the market already had competitors with half or twice as fast of a turnaround time than my current client. Now, we pushed back on them to understand and try and see if there's anything they could do, but they stood pat with their reasoning, went forward. But unfortunately, the business case just wasn't there, and they had to put their whole project on pause, but only after spending a significant amount of money and time to get there. So that's something critical to think about, but when to do this. And you could tell from what I talked about just above, right? In this case, it's obvious you want to find this information out earlier in the process of developing your, early in the steps when you're trying to develop your process, right? In this case, if they would have known that the turnaround time is twice as slow and it's going to be extremely hard to kind of get there, they might have pivoted and gone in a different direction. But this doesn't always apply, right? Understand and figure out whether the user feedback that you're getting here is actually something you need to pivot with now, or is this something that you can push off later? And part of this is engaging with your usability and your engineering team. Turnaround time, obvious, needs to happen now. Well, maybe the second thing is like a user fill port on a tube or something that you're designing. Well, maybe finding that out doesn't mean you can't already start the leap and start some other parallel paths so you can move the ball forward. It's case by case, but again, have those conversations with your development team and understand what repercussions you may or may not have by making a decision to go forward. And again, a good engineering team will be able to help you go that way, but it's up to you as well to understand and start those conversations out. Now, doing your user needs and getting this information extremely robust is important because this actually falls into the next topic we're going to discuss, which is requirements. So I want to make sure we get aligned on the same page with requirements here. The first part of requirements for me breaks into two different things. The first part is product requirements, as I've mentioned. Now, product requirements explain a few different things. First off, by doing market research, user testing, and doing different interviews and getting key stakeholder needs from inside your company, you're able to pull in information and formulate a document that tells you what does your product need to do? What about the user? What are the things that we need to account for such that users will feel the need to purchase this product? And are there other business needs to account for? For example, are there costs for this device that only make it financially viable if that target is met? Putting all this information together in a fairly robust document is important because what happens is once you make that leap and get into the development side, your engineering team will start to take over a bit. They will take that product requirements document and turn it into what we at Goddard within our QMS, our quality management system, call design input requirements. Now, you might have heard this from other companies called system requirements specifications or instrument and consumable requirements specifications. Those to me are all the same terminology. They're all synonymous. We're going to call them DIs for the rest of this presentation. But you can already kind of tell what's going on here, right? If you set up a product requirement that is a little bit fuzzy or doesn't exactly lead things in the correct direction, this information will get translated into a DI, which then gets translated back from that engineering team, and they're going to take that as their blueprint and start to run. So one example I can show you that actually luckily went in a positive direction, but could have been problematic. We were designing a device that had to sit in a lab space on a lab bench. And one thing I can tell a lot of you already know is lab bench space is extremely valuable. There isn't a lot of space for different devices to be on there. And so you have a restricted amount of space to work within. And for this specific instance, the client wanted there to be an onboard computer to do processing of images. They wanted a touch screen, and then they actually wanted the functional device on the inside as well. Now, the way they wanted to process this device was with machine learning, which required some decent amount of computational power, among other things. Now, the challenge is extremely difficult here because there's a lot to do in a short amount of time, as is always the case. But we were able to luckily push back on the client and challenge them. Why do you need this to be here? And throughout the back and forths, we learned that it was a little bit more of a whim decision made by them, and that they eventually caved and said, you know what, we can just do a little bit of a central lab, a lab computer. So you can leave this device on here, but then we'll Ethernet it out to a separate space where there is the computer that you need. Well, this small whim change that was made that helped us out, it helped us out significantly because now we had an external computer that was more regularly able to be upgraded. We were able to put in a more computationally powerful system. We now have bigger screens to view the images. But on the instrument side itself, now we don't have a huge heat source in there. We don't have to worry about how that might impact the sample in the system. So there were significant downstream repercussions that eventually saved them a significant amount of time and money, but almost cost them because they didn't understand how critical that small decision was that they were making. So really, understanding and making a robust set of requirements, but engaging and having an open discussion with your development team to understand what's going on is critical. Now, one other requirement example I want to give you here before we move on is relevant today because of COVID-19. So there's a lot of different diagnostic devices that have been coming out to tell you whether or not you have a disease. The thing about them is, and you guys might be familiar with this, not all of them have the same accuracy as other ones. And specifically the terminology used here is sensitivity and specificity, which in layman's terms discusses false positives and false negatives. Now, it's case by case. In this situation, the goal of these companies was to get a product out there because one needed to get out there and there was a market for it. So they didn't worry as much about sensitivity specificity. Yes, the information needed, the results needed to be better than a coin flip in terms of telling you whether or not you had the disease, but did it need to be in that 95th percentile of information? Not at the get-go. They're willing to get there and build. Now, versus other clients I've had where they're trying to get into a saturated market, and they therefore needed, as their market separator, to have a better sensitivity and specificity than their competitors. But as a result, that led to more development time to basically tweak and test the system and update it to get it there. So both of those things have different repercussions. But again, all of these things and the directions that the engineering team and the development team take are directly reliant on the client, which is in this case you, and how much and how well you know your product requirements and what needs to get there. So setting that foundation right from the get-go helps you go on that right path. Now, I also completely understand that a couple of slides ago, I talked about the timing and not spending too much time. There is a delicate balance, but the more you understand about your product and the quicker you're able to do it, the more successful you can be. So next, I'm going to talk about workflow. So before we get into this, I just want to also get on the same page with what is meant by workflow, or at least what I mean by workflow. So again, and I apologize, I keep using diagnostics in this case, but let's say you have a sample that you need to, at the end, tell whether there's a positive or negative. Well, in this sample, you might mix it with a fluid. You might then take that fluid and mix it for a certain amount of time. Then you might heat it to a certain temperature. Then you might take that sample, extract a certain portion, look at it with fluorescence detection, and then get your results. Those steps broken down is the workflow that we're discussing. Now, why is clearly defining your process important? So here's another example. A client asked us to develop a thermal cycler for PCR. So essentially we were taking a sample, moving it up to a certain temperature for denaturing, roughly around 90 C, 92.5 C, and then bringing it down for anneal extend roughly at 65 degrees Celsius. So they gave us that challenge. And our first question to them is, excellent, what's the tolerance on that? And they said, well, 1/10 of a degree. That gave us extreme pause on our side. If that was a real number that we had to hit, I don't want to say anything is impossible, but that is very close to. One reason is because even the sensors required to read what the system is doing have their own error of 1/10 of a degree. And then from there, there's even more errors that come into play here. And so we pushed back on them and asked, where is this number coming from? And why do you think this has to be the case? And the response we got surprised us because it was, well, we wanted to start tight and then we figured we could loosen. Well, unfortunately, if we didn't push back on them and we decided to try and hit those numbers, the amount of time and effort to try and hit a borderline impossible target would have been insane, extremely expensive, not productive by any means. So luckily we pushed back on them and they essentially decided, you know what, we're going to go back to our process and we're going to challenge it. We're going to try and shift the variables, move them around and see how well it does. And in the end, we found out that they were able to be plus or minus an entire degree Celsius on their system. What that allowed us to do is it simplified our design significantly, allowed us to use cheaper components, and the development process was even quicker than it was before by a significant margin. So being able to break down that process, but also understand where the different levers are to turn and what the different impacts of that are will help you out. Now, do all of these need to be established before you make that leap? It depends. And again, this is where that open discussion is with your development team. Discuss with them what the impacts are. Hey, if I make this tight, if I make this half a degree or make this a quarter of a degree, is this a 2-month or is this a 4-month change, or is this 2 days versus 4 days? And then you can make your assessment of, do I need to go back and figure out something from my end on the earlier side? Or can we kind of push forward and handle this side later? Open lines of communication here are absolutely critical. It ensures less mistakes and less assumptions made by the engineering team. And it makes sure that the process that you have done on the lab bench that is really important and needs to work in a certain way is actually translated when automated. Now, I keep talking about this in terms of diagnostics, but this actually applies for anything. Let's say you're designing a surgical tool and you need to implant an anchor into a bone, right? At the end of the day, you could still break it down with, okay, you need to install the anchor into the system. You need to create the hole into the bone. You need to insert the implant, and you need to disconnect the whole thing. And you can break those down into different steps and understand what are the different repercussions, this hole size, how tight, or what's the tolerance on that. There's a lot of different steps you can ask and a lot of questions you can ask and understand what those repercussions are. So the final topic that we're going to talk about here is future proofing. Now, I'm going to be upfront with you. This one is a highly recommended option, but it absolutely is a nice to have. You can do all of the other steps that I've talked about before and still successfully get to market. But the example I'll give you is here. One of our clients wanted to do fluorescence detection for a target. Now, in this case, you only need, if you're only identifying one target, then you only need one set of optics to go through. And it can be a very stationary system to shine light in and get light back and receive, and get your results accordingly. But this client had the foresight and said, look, this target that is going to get us into the market, it's not as important. Our money is going to be in the future products, and we want to start planning for them now. So each of these that have their own separate fluorescence detection systems that need to be in there, add a different set of filters. So even though this product we were developing was only using one set, we now had a roulette of different options in there that weren't going to be used at the get-go. But what it did for us is, first, it got the design set for the future. Secondly, for this product, we spaced all our components out in a correct way from the start, so that when they get into their second and third iteration products, all of the reorganization, they don't have to do any of that. All of the system testing, they don't have to do any of that. In the meantime, they can focus on developing their assay. And when they're ready, they'll be ready to jump in with this system that already exists and is pretty much already there. There might be some slight firmware and software updates, but a good chunk of it's there. They're able to maybe they get to market a month or two slower with their first target, but then they might accelerate and get the second target and third targets and iterations in 6 months ahead of time. So really take a second, think a little bit about the future and understand with your development team again, right? If I tell my development team to focus on designing for multiple options from the get-go, does this add an extra year and an extra $1 million of development? Or does it only add a month and maybe it's only 50,000? Doing that math and quick checks in there and having that open discussion will help you be able to lead your team correctly and also help you be more successful quicker down the line. So we're kind of at the end here. The upshot, right? There's a fine balance between jumping too quickly and waiting too long. You want to make sure you kind of get that balance right as best as you can. Do a little bit of math and understand where you stand so you can make an informed decision. Understanding user helps confirm your core technology is ready for the market. Now, that's critical. It allows you to assess whether you need to stop and make significant adjustments to your process or whether you can plow forward. But it makes it so you jump in knowing what you need to know from the get-go, gives you the best chance for success. Thoughtful product requirements will save you time and money. Can't hammer this enough as far as my own experience, because I'm usually on the engineering side. Whenever I have clients that give rough or loose product requirements, that's a flag for me to push really hard on the client to get them to establish those, because as soon as I set my team to start developing, they're going to start moving, and having to pivot and go different directions is just going to cost more time and effort. Finally, breaking down your process helps ensure your development team understands and designs to your expectations, right? Open lines of communication, but breaking down that system helps it so people can digest and focus on those individual areas and make sure that everything is understood about it. Because at the end of the day, we really want to make sure, as an engineering and development team, we want to make sure that our clients are getting the process that they developed on the bench out in this actual system. And finally, it's important to think ahead and to do it early on. Again, nice to have, but doing this could save you time and money. So focusing on these items, thinking about them, and being able to make informed decisions either before that leap or early on in that leap will allow you to have those open discussions with your team and go down the right path. Can't hammer that enough. But that's about it here. So before I kind of open it to any questions, really wanted to thank you for your time. Outside of this presentation, if you have any questions here, feel free to get in contact with us through any of these methods that are shown up here. My colleague and good friend, Kate, she's our business development manager. She can answer a lot of your questions or point you in the right direction. But otherwise, I wanted to open this up for any questions here.
Awesome, thank you, Ajay. So if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot them in the chat box or in the Q&A function, and then we'll read the questions out for you. But I guess just to start us off, what do you do if product requirements set by user input / research conflict with one another or are mutually incompatible?
So that's a really tough one. The big thing you want to do is first prioritize, right? Not every requirement from the user standpoint is going to be equally just as important as the other. But let's say in this hypothetical, just to make it a little harder on myself, that they are equally important. In a perfect world with enough time, you might go and dig a little bit further. Maybe you're able to contact those users again to get further feedback, or maybe you're able to do another study to try and dig into that further, especially if they're critical. But secondly, right, after that prioritization aspect, look at the criticality. See if the impact of making a wrong decision here is really going to hurt you down the line in terms of money costs, money or time. So no great answer here, right? If you have something that needs to do 60,000 different things but can only cost 1 penny, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble. So at the end of the day, if you come to the conclusion that these are absolutely critical requirements, they are absolutely against each other in every which way, and all the users that I've talked to did not give me any one way to go or another, then that's actually a chance to reflect on yourself and see if the market is ready for this kind of a product, right? If what you're trying to deliver is only going to be accepted at a certain price point and that you can't reach that by any means, maybe the technology needs to get developed further in order to get down there. There's no one good answer, but it requires prioritization, asking questions further of your user, and making tough decisions.
Awesome. So we had a question come in. How do you manage the budget expectations for a project when it comes to scope change for a time and materials project?
That's a good one. So part of it is, and I'm assuming this is again from my client side, right? So this is from your side. This comes back to the open communication with your engineering team. So I know that when I challenge my team when there needs to be a scope change, the questions I ask are, what are the aspects, what are the different tasks that need to get done? How much time is that going to take? And what does that mean in terms of budget, right? And so from that point, we come up with a range of different possibilities. We look at kind of the worst case, and we look at kind of the best case. And then you openly communicate that, right? When you work in a communicative standpoint, it's not throwing something over the fence, it's working to a solution together. So essentially, there's going to be times where the development team just doesn't know an answer. Let's say you're doing some FEA. That's usually one of the toughest ones where someone says, how much time is it going to take? I might guess 3 days and it might take a week and a half. For those situations, you try and have an experienced team and you try and dig out of them to understand what are the challenges against them. But there just are scenarios where you can't know the answer and you have to be sure that there aren't ways to know it, but then you just have to openly communicate it. I hope that kind of answered the question. It's a difficult one.
Thank you. Who do you think is in the best position to prioritize those user needs or product requirements? The engineering team or the client themselves?
Definitely the client themselves. So one thing I also want to make clear is, as you guys as the client, this is your product. You own it, right? So while it is completely fair to ask for feedback and thoughts from the engineering team, as you should, the engineering team might not have the same desires or end goals as you, the client, do for your own product. So by all means, gather all the feedback and the input and the information, but at the end, that decision for where to prioritize is up to you. Now, what I hope happens is by taking the correct steps, you're able to make a logical decision because it's based in data, right? You've gone back, you've gotten that extra set of user information that help you lead one way or another, combined with some market research. Hopefully that's the case, but at some point, it is going to come down to you to make that decision.
So we had another question. How can we mitigate the regulatory risk for breakthrough medical device development where there is no clear regulations at place at the moment?
That's a difficult one. One thing I highly recommend is finding a regulatory consultant to converse with throughout the process and get some tips along the way. Waiting until the end and kind of sending something off into the abyss and hoping it kind of goes right and then getting feedback, that's the wrong move. Get some feedback, get some help to kind of search on that side and figure out what to do. On the other side of that, understanding whether you're de novo or 510K is obviously important. And then at that point, it's making sure that your team is following the different types of risk processes and is doing enough testing in the right directions, right? But not everyone will have all the answers. Calling and talking to different resource experts early on will help you understand what's ahead of you. And one of our clients right now is asking us to essentially do that. And what we're going to do is we have a consultant on the side that we use that's able to help guide us in certain directions. We're going to make those calls. We're going to do some research, compile all the documentation of things that we might need to do, and then establish our plan of attack going forward.
Awesome. So we kind of talked a lot about making the leap smoothly by following these best commercialization, making these best practices. But what do you do if you've already started down the path of commercialization and you realize you need to go back and do a whole bunch of work? So any tips to smoothly manage potentially costly changes to the product development plan?
Yeah. The biggest thing that's slightly controversial is to pause, right? So I've been on plenty of teams where we've been driven by our clients to keep going. Yes, figure out this issue, but keep throwing a Band-Aid on it and maybe we'll get there to the end. And almost every single time, the right answer looking back was to stop, reflect, figure out what's going on, do some planning, establish on which path you want to go forward with, and then pick it back up again. One of those thermal cyclers that I talked about before, just from a design side, there were different constraints on it where we'd learn more and more as time kind of went on, and the design went from being close to working to maybe starting to not work to maybe starting to not work, and we try and make a small tweak to the design here or there. At some point, I had to go to my PM and tell her, we need to stop for 2 weeks. This is going to delay things, but we need to look at a full redesign here. So we stopped, engaged with the client, established everything that we needed to know going forward, came up with a full design, got full reviews across the board, restarted again, didn't have problems from that point. Being able to stop and do that, it takes courage from you as a client to know that look, this can hurt me down the line a bit, but sometimes continuing to plow through will just make it worse and worse.
Awesome. So let's say like we're a small brand new startup and we're just beginning to develop a product, but obviously we need to do market research. What advice would you might give to like brand new startups that have their product, but they need to begin to do that, I guess, market segmentation or to do research on whether their product is a viable product and it's something that the market wants? What are some ways that like people can actually see if their product is in the market need?
Yeah. So Sarah, I actually want to put you on the spot a little bit here. So Sarah is our marketing director at Goddard. Is this something you might be able to answer a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to take this question on. It's sort of an interesting question because I would encourage you, and Ajay, I'm sure this is something you could speak to. I would say those things are sort of in the wrong order. You would hopefully be wanting to do a little bit of market research and understand the market, the competitive landscape, all of that before you have a fully formed product. And as you're going through the product development process, it's definitely not something you want to save for the end, because what you might do is put all this work and time and money into creating this product, this interesting novel technology, only to discover that there really isn't a place for it in the market, or that users want something totally different. I don't know, Ajay, what do you think?
No, that sounds about right. I mean, just to be honest here on my side, as far as direct marketing research, it's not something that I have an expertise in. Google definitely tells you whether different products are already out there, but knowing who your competitors are is extremely important. Sometimes going to different trade shows where your product might fit in and seeing the different companies that may or may not adjacently be doing similar things that you're doing is important as well. Also, at those trade shows, you'll find a lot of users there that might be doing things. So there might be ways to set up different question answer situations or interviews where you can get some more information.
Yeah, I would just say that, the work on the market side of things is in some ways inherently tied into usability, and that stuff has to be done at the front end of things.
Awesome. So I think kind of just to add upon that is, I feel like previously before COVID, a lot of these like companies could meet in person, like go to whatever site that they had to go and to maybe display the product or even just ask questions. But I guess in this new situation where we're kind of like remote.
I think he froze on us. That's sort of the COVID era.
Yeah, that's tough. It's not easy to kind of show your products, of course, when you can't do it in person. But I do know, for example, AACC is coming up soon, and it's a virtual conference. So you're able to go to those kinds of things and meet with people and set up meetings along those lines. So it's essentially about being creative, right? Maybe your team is able to still do those surveys, but show different images of similar types of products or show it in certain ways that focus on the usability areas you might be interested in. But everyone's in the same boat, right? If you absolutely need to be doing this right now, try it out. At least get some information and then look at it objectively and see whether you're actually able to glean real feedback from it or whether you need to do another spin at it.
Ajay, maybe you could take a little bit of time to talk about how our engineers have adapted to the sort of remote work era. It's sort of an interesting time for engineers when our work is so tactile and we benefit so greatly from being all together as a group and brainstorming. I don't know, maybe just speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, definitely challenging. The best part of engineering is being there at your computer, stuck on a problem, then you literally swivel your chair, pull some people over and ask them a question or two and have them look at some stuff. What we've had to pivot to, and luckily Teams and Zoom have done a great job of this, is just a very quick phone call. You spin some CAD or you draw an image on a piece of paper and you hold it up in front of your screen and walk through it. But making sure that the team is available, making it known that you are available to help with people and staying on top of it allows people to slightly more inefficiently, but still have those conversations quickly. So oftentimes I'll grab, so these are actually only a couple of the team here. We've grown. This was a very early image when we just started the branch. But Chris and Tyler here, every once in a while, I'll say, hey, do you have 5 minutes? We'll do a quick chat. I'll run by a problem with them, get some feedback, and be able to kind of move forward. But communication and making sure that it's not just in text has been really critical here, especially with balancing what our client needs are.
So it does look like we had another question that came in. The question to you, Ajay, is what role from our side, so that would be the client side of things, would you say is most critical or contributes the most impactful input to your engineering side of things?
It's the requirements, right? So, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but being able to have an objective conversation with our client as to why does this need to be the way it is? And sometimes that's a combative conversation and it comes across as combative, but usually when it comes from my engineering team, it's because this being the way it has to be hurts things down the line or adds a lot more complexity than we'd like. So having a client that is open and understands what the repercussions are and is willing to be flexible with us. I'm completely fine with the client that says, no, this is the way it has to be, but it helps when we understand on our side why it has to be that way, because then we can go gung-ho with the confidence that, hey, we're not going to get pulled in another direction. Alternatively, on the other side of that, I have clients that change their requirements every day, right? It depends on the weather. I had a client recently that had us push for a single-handed use device that needed to be a very specific way. They're just about to do a human trial, and we found out that something is actually different about what they're trying to do, which completely changes a significant portion of the design and no longer makes it as successful as it was before. Okay, we're happy to help, but unfortunately, this is a significant amount of redesign. It's going to delay your ability to do this test and your ability to get to market. And it's frustrating, right? On one side, even though we're a product development firm and we get paid to do the work, we like to see our clients succeed and we think of it as a partnership. So it's frustrating when those are very simple things that we could all do together better to make things more successful.
That's great, thanks. I think that's it from the question side of things. I want to thank everyone.
Awesome. So sorry, Samuel had some technical, his computer just completely decided to kaput. Hi everyone, I'm Karen with University Lab Partners. Kind of chiming in. It's so great to see everybody. And oh, there's another question that actually came up from Madi. Assume that you developed a platform technology that can be used for multiple medical devices and drugs. If you want to select your first product, 1, the product with existing competitors and available regulatory information. 2, a product unique without competitor and regulatory information. Madi, if you want, you can, would you like to come live on the mic and maybe ask your question? I'm a little bit confused by your, the clarity of your question.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for your great presentation. Actually, this is a real case that we are working on it. We have developed a new platform technology based on the new active agent. This active agent can be used in multiple applications, multiple medical devices, and also drugs. Some of them actually, let me be clear. For example, we can use this active agent in hand sanitizer to be the first organic hand sanitizer. There are existing hand sanitizer in the market with the regulations, but we can compete with them with the known regulatory information. But at the other side, we can have it as a antimicrobial plastic and polymer in order to make the PPE with self-sanitizing characteristics. These medical devices are going to be introduced to FDA for the first time. There is no such a PPE that can self-sanitize its surface automatically and in long term. These are some new medical devices that, as I told, there is no regulatory at the moment with the FDA, and we requested for a new breakthrough medical device designation by FDA. So if you want to, let's say, have your first product, do you go after the new self-sanitizing PPE as a medical device, or to go after the hand sanitizer with the organic active agent, which you have competitors and also you have in place regulatory?
That's an excellent question. So the questions I'd actually ask back to you, right, is how saturated is the market that already exists? For example, let's say there's only one product out there, or maybe two, and you feel like your product is significantly better, and that the market that you want to grab here will significantly help your business. That's something to factor in, versus if there's 10 or 15 other products, then maybe your odds of successfully wrangling that are lower compared to going in the other direction where you will be first to market and it's a space that will help your business, right? The question you're asking, I feel, is really your business case in terms of what's the right direction to go. So that's where I would think about it personally. I would want to give you a caveat. This is not my expertise at all, but if I were in your shoes, I try and understand how successfully you think you would be able to grab the market in the saturated one already. If there's a good chance and that is something that is worth pursuing from a dollar standpoint, then that's something to consider versus going the other way. But that's my approach, at least that I think of.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, thank you so much. Khalid, would you like to get on the mic and ask your question? Let me go ahead and give you mic access.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, thanks for this great presentation. I actually joined in a little bit later, so I apologize for that. Anyway, so my question is regarding the regulatory affairs role during core team meetings. So how would you say that how can regulatory be a more effective partner during the medical device product development? In other words, what challenges does an R&D or an engineer see the most frequently that that they have the hardest time understanding or grasping the concept? How can regulatory be a better, more effective partner with that?
That's an excellent question. From my experience working with the regulatory, it's really trying to understand what needs to get done. That's the biggest challenge my team has. Usually we're in the middle of just trying to develop the concept and move the technology forward and de-risk it. But you end up missing different other documentation or other testing that needs to happen, and especially engage with from an earlier standpoint. So to me, the best input that regulatory can provide is where the different checkpoints are, where the different hurdles are, where if we don't do this at this point, this is going to cost us down the line. And so really driving them, because it's not their responsibility to necessarily provide that input, but having your team lead, whether it's your systems or your systems lead or your program manager, whoever it is, push on that regulatory person to provide feedback in that way as time goes on. When do we need to do what we need to do? And how much time does it take? So if they don't know when, you can at least take that information and provide that back. That's generally the biggest problem I've ever had with this kind of stuff.
No, that totally makes sense. So if I hear what you're saying that identify the regulatory risks and hurdles earlier than later on in the development process, right?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.